One small act of kindness, or one single word of truth, can spread like a wildfire through the world. Witness the stories of those who ignited change and inspired others to do the same. Hit subscribe now and help us spread the light today.
I was wrong about my grandson. That's the hardest thing I've ever had to say out loud, and I've said a lot of hard things in 67 years. I was wrong, and by the time I understood just how wrong I was, Daniel was already gone. He died on a Tuesday in March, a 2-lane highway outside of Millbrook, Ohio, a curve he had driven 1,000 times. The police said it was a tire blowout. They said he never had a chance to correct. They handed me a folder with a report number on it and told me to call if I had questions, and then they left me standing in the kitchen of the house where I'd lived for 31 years, holding that folder and not being able to remember how to breathe. Daniel was 34 years old. He had his mother's eyes, my father's chin, and a laugh that could fill up a room so completely there was no space left for anything dark. He had been the kind of boy who fixed things before you knew they were broken. A leaking gutter, a bad alternator, a grandfather who was slowly losing his grip on the world after his wife of 40 years passed. My wife, Eleanor, died 2.5 years before Daniel did. After she went, the days started blurring together in a way I couldn't explain to anyone who hadn't felt it. I stopped cooking real meals. I stopped returning phone calls. I sat in her chair sometimes, the blue one by the window, and I just watched the yard go from green to brown and back again, and I didn't do much else. Daniel was the one who pulled me back. He came over every Sunday without being asked. He brought groceries and put them away without making a production of it. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and talked about his week, about the construction company he'd been working so hard to grow, about small things and large things, and he made me feel like the world was still worth participating in. I didn't tell him that enough. I told myself I'd tell him eventually, when things felt less raw, when I found the right words. I never found them in time. His wife, Renee, I never warmed to. I want to be honest about that, because it matters to the rest of what I have to tell you. I thought it was grief making me suspicious. I thought it was an old man's stubbornness, the way older people sometimes resist anyone new entering the family circle. Renee was polished in a way that made me uneasy, always the right thing at the right moment, always watching with those pale eyes that didn't quite match her smile. When she came to Sunday dinners, she sat close to Daniel and talked too much and laughed too loudly at things that weren't that funny. Daniel adored her, or he seemed to. He talked about her the way you talk about something you're working very hard to believe in. After the funeral, she was composed in that way that made neighbors whisper to each other about how strong she was. She wore a gray dress and accepted condolences with her chin up and her eyes dry, and people said she was remarkable. I stood 10 feet away and felt a coldness I couldn't name. The will was simple. Daniel had left everything to Renee, the house they shared, a savings account, the small share he'd built in his construction business. His lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Cott Holloway, who had an office above a hardware store in downtown Millbrook, called me a week after the service to tell me Daniel had also left me his grandfather's watch, the one that had belonged to my own father. It had stopped working years ago, but Daniel had always loved it. I thanked Mr. Tundau, Holloway, and hung up, and I sat with that stopped watch in my palm for a long time. I thought that was the end of it. I thought grief was the only thing left. 4 months passed. The yard went green again. I started cooking eggs in the morning, which felt like progress. Renee called twice in those 4 months. Brief calls about practical things. Had I found the title to the truck Daniel sometimes parked at my place? Did I know anything about a storage unit in his name? I answered what I could and we hung up, and there was nothing warm on either end of the line. Then, one morning in July, I found a padded envelope in my mailbox. No return address except a post office box in Columbus. My name written in block letters I didn't recognize. Inside was a USB drive, small and black, and a folded note on legal stationery that read, "Daniel asked me to send this to you 6 months after his passing if he had not done so himself. I am honoring that request. R. Holloway." I stood at the mailbox for a long time. A truck went by on the road. A dog barked somewhere down the block. I went back inside and set the drive on the kitchen table and made coffee I didn't drink. and then I sat down and plugged it into the old laptop Daniel had set up for me the previous Christmas. There was one folder on the drive. Inside it, two things, a video file and a folder of documents. I opened the video. Daniel was sitting at the desk in what I recognized as his home office, the shelf of construction manuals behind him, the framed photo of the two of us fishing up at Lake Erie in the corner. He was wearing a gray t-shirt, and he looked tired in the way I hadn't let myself notice when he was alive. There were shadows under his eyes. He was leaning forward slightly, his elbows on the desk, and when he started talking, it was in that quiet, careful voice he only used when something mattered very much. He said, "Hey, Grandpa, if you're watching this, then something happened to me, and I wasn't able to come over on a Sunday and say this the right way. I'm sorry about that. I wanted to say it in person. I want you to know that first." I pressed pause. I pressed it 3 times before I let myself keep watching. He told me he had been diagnosed 8 months before he died. Not a terminal illness, not in the dramatic sense, a serious heart arrhythmia. The kind that could be managed with medication and monitoring, but that had a way of making a person think about contingencies. He had not told me because he didn't want me worrying, which was, he said with a slight smile that broke something open in my chest, very much a thing I would have done. He said he hoped I'd forgive him for that. But that wasn't the most important thing he needed to tell me. He said he had started noticing things about 8 months ago, around the same time he got the diagnosis. Small things at first. Renee taking calls in another room and going quiet when he walked in. A second phone he found in the glove box of her car when he was looking for the registration. Text messages he saw by accident when her screen lit up on the nightstand. Messages from a contact saved only as a letter, M, that didn't read like messages between friends. He hired a private investigator for 3 weeks. He didn't want to believe what he was starting to think. He wanted to be wrong. The investigator gave him photographs and the typed summary and a name, Marcus Drell, who had grown up 2 towns over from Millbrook and now worked in real estate finance in Columbus. Renee had known him since before she met Daniel. The relationship had never stopped. Daniel said he could have walked away from the marriage. He had thought about it. He had spent several very bad weeks thinking about almost nothing else. But then he started finding other things that had nothing to do with the affair, and everything to do with me. Renee had been talking to Marcus about my property. I own the house I've lived in for 31 years and the 2 acres behind it, and there's a strip of land along the back edge that borders a commercial corridor that has been quietly appreciating in value for years. Daniel had known about this. He'd mentioned it once, casually, that I was sitting on something worth more than I realized, and I should talk to a financial planner. I hadn't done it because I didn't care about any of that. Eleanor and I had built our life on that land, and I intended to die there, and that was the end of my thinking about it. But Renee cared, and Marcus cared. And what Daniel found, buried in emails he accessed from Renee's laptop while she was out of town for a weekend, was a detailed plan, not hypothetical, not exploratory, a plan with a timeline. The plan involved waiting until Daniel was out of the picture. By whatever means, Daniel said, and he paused when he said it, and his jaw worked, and then positioning Renee as the grieving daughter-in-law, the one closest to me, the one helping me manage things in my vulnerable state. Marcus had connections to a property management company. The idea was to get power of attorney over my affairs, citing my age and the loss of my wife, and then my grandson as evidence of diminished capacity. They had already consulted with a lawyer in Columbus who was not Mr. Holloway. They had a timeline. The timeline started approximately 90 days after Daniel's expected death. I had to stop the video. I walked to the kitchen sink and ran cold water over my wrists, the way Eleanor used to tell me to do when my blood pressure spiked. I stood there for a while. The yard was green and bright outside the window. It looked the same as always. Everything looked the same. I went back and finished watching. Daniel said he had documented everything. The emails, the photographs, the text from the second phone, which he had photographed extensively before putting back, a recorded conversation. And here he explained it carefully, knowing I would need the explanation, between Renee and Marcus in the living room of their house while Daniel was supposedly at a job site, captured by a small device he had placed behind a row of books on the shelf. He had uploaded everything automatically to a secure cloud account the moment it was recorded, with a secondary backup to a drive he gave to Mr. Holloway personally. hand-delivered, with signed and notarized instructions about when and how to release it. He looked directly at the camera when he explained this and said, "I know you're going to want to know how." That's how, Grandpa, I thought of everything. He almost smiled when he said it. It was the most Daniel thing I had ever seen. He said he had also, quietly, over the previous 2 years, been putting money aside. Not a fortune, he wasn't a wealthy man, but enough. He had paid off the remaining balance on my property taxes for the next 4 years. He had set up a small account in both our names at a credit union in Canton, with a balance that would cover my basic expenses for 18 months. He had done it without telling me because, he said, he knew I would argue with him about it and he didn't have the energy for that argument. "You always said you didn't need anything from me," he said. "But that was never the point, Grandpa. That was never why I came over on Sundays." He said he loved me. He said he was sorry if this was hard to watch. He said Mr. Meaden, Holloway had everything, and to call him as soon as I was done watching, and to not wait, and not second guess, and not worry about whether I was overreacting, because I wasn't. Then he reached forward, and the screen went dark. I sat in that kitchen for a long time. Outside, a cloud passed over the sun, and the yard went gray and then bright again. I thought about 34 years of a person being alive in the world, and how much of what matters about a person happens quietly, in the spaces between the things you actually witness. I thought about all the Sundays I had accepted gratefully without ever asking what it cost him to show up. I thought about how he had been carrying all of this, the diagnosis, the betrayal, the fear of what would happen to me, and had shown up at that kitchen table anyway and talked about small things and made me feel like the world was worth being in. I called Mr. Holloway. He answered on the second ring, as though he had been expecting me, which I suppose he had been. He spoke carefully and precisely in the way that lawyers speak, when they are being very serious. He said he had been holding the full package of documentation for 4 months, and that he had also, with Daniel's prior instruction, already made preliminary contact with the Millbrook County Sheriff's Office 3 weeks earlier to notify them that evidence might be forthcoming. He had wanted to give me time to receive the drive first. He said it was what Daniel had wanted. He asked me if I was all right. I told him I didn't know yet. He said that was a reasonable answer. I asked him how we proceed. What followed was not fast. I want to be honest about that because the movies always make justice look clean and quick, and it isn't. It took 11 weeks from the day I called Mr. Holloway to the day Renee and Marcus were formally charged. There were interviews with investigators. There were 2 meetings with the county prosecutor, a serious woman named Carol Reeves, who had short gray hair and a way of making you feel like the facts mattered and the facts were on our side. There were phone calls I didn't fully understand, and documents I signed in offices that smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. There were mornings when I woke up and felt the whole weight of it pressing down. The grief and the anger and the strangeness of being protected by someone who was no longer here to know that it had worked. The recorded conversation was the center of it. Daniel's device had captured 42 minutes of Renee and Marcus talking in the living room on a Wednesday afternoon. They talked about the arrhythmia diagnosis, which Renee had told Marcus about in terms that made clear she had been watching Daniel's health situation the way a person watches a clock. They talked about my property, about the Columbus lawyer, about the timeline. Marcus said at one point that the old man was practically handing it to them. That was what the prosecutor read aloud in my presence. And I kept my hands flat on the table, and I breathed steadily, and I thought about Daniel sitting across from me on Sundays talking about his week, carrying all of this, protecting me. There were also the emails, which established the financial planning in detail, and there was testimony from Daniel's private investigator, who had kept meticulous records, and there were the photographs. It was enough. Carol Reeves told me it was more than enough. She said in 20 years of prosecution, she had rarely seen a case so thoroughly prepared by a private individual. I told her his name was Daniel, and he was 34, and he liked to fix things before you knew they were broken. She wrote his name down on her legal pad, and I appreciated that. Renee was charged with conspiracy to commit financial elder abuse, fraud, and several related counts. Marcus was charged alongside her. The Columbus lawyer who had been consulted lost his license in a separate proceeding. There was a preliminary hearing in October, and I sat in the second row, and I kept my hands in my lap, and I watched Renee walk in, and she did not look at me. She had the same composed quality she'd had at the funeral, the chin up, the controlled posture. But her eyes were different now. Something had gone out of them. Whatever calculation she had been running since before Daniel and I ever met had finally hit a wall it couldn't get around. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be careful to say that. I felt something older and quieter than triumph. I felt like a debt had been acknowledged that could never actually be paid. After the hearing, I drove back to Millbrook on the two-lane highway that runs past the turnoff where Daniel's accident had happened. I had avoided that road since March. I don't know why I took it that day. Maybe I wasn't ready to avoid it anymore. I slowed down when I passed the spot. There was a small cross in the gravel shoulder that someone had planted, white with a laminated photograph attached. I had put it there myself in April, on a morning when I didn't know what else to do with my hands. I pulled over and sat for a moment with the engine running. I had spent 4 months believing Daniel had died without warning me, without leaving me prepared, without finding a way to reach back across whatever divide death makes between people and tell me the things that needed to be said. I had spent 4 months feeling like the connection between us had just stopped, like a clock that finally runs down. I was wrong about that. He had left me more prepared than I had any right to expect. He had spent the last year of his life building a wall between me and the people who wanted to take what Eleanor and I had made together. He had done it without fanfare, and without asking for anything in return, and without ever letting me see the effort on his face when he sat down at my kitchen table on Sundays. The watch he left me, the one that had belonged to my father, I had taken it to a repair shop in August on an impulse I couldn't fully explain. The man there, older than me, hands like a craftsman's, turned it over and opened the back and looked for a long time, and then he looked up and said, "This is a good movement, just needs cleaning. I can have it running by Thursday." I picked it up on Thursday. It ran perfectly. I've worn it every day since. I don't know how to end a story like this because I don't think stories like this end in any clean way. Renee and Marcus are moving through a legal process that will take time and produce an outcome I've been told to expect, but not to count on until it happens. I am still living in the house I've lived in for 31 years. I still sit in Eleanor's blue chair by the window sometimes and watch the yard go from green to brown and back again. The difference is that I do not sit there now wondering whether connection is real or whether it persists or whether the people we love leave us anything when they go. I know the answer. My grandson showed me. He showed me that love is not always visible in the moment you most need to see it. Sometimes it's working in the background, making backups, notarizing documents, setting up accounts at credit unions in Canton, placing devices behind bookshelves on Wednesday afternoons. Sometimes the person who loves you most is the one whose effort is entirely invisible until it's the only thing left standing. Sundays are different now. I still have them, the same hours, the same light through the kitchen window, the same yard. I don't feel them the same way I used to, but I have started calling his friends, the people who knew him, the guys from the construction crew who come by sometimes and sit at my kitchen table and eat the food I've started cooking again and tell me things about Daniel I didn't know. Stories from job sites, a thing he did for a coworker going through a hard time. The way he talked about me, apparently, in ways he never quite got around to saying to my face. I listened to all of it. I write some of it down. He was the kind of person who fixed things before you knew they were broken. I knew that about him. What I didn't know was how long he had been doing it, how quietly, how completely, how much it cost him, and how the love behind it doesn't diminish just because the person is gone. The clock on the wall of my kitchen runs. The watch on my wrist runs. Some things, if they're built right, just keep going. I was wrong about my grandson. I thought he had left me unprepared. I thought he had kept too much from me, and that I would never understand why. I understand now. He kept it from me because he was protecting me, the way he always had, the way I didn't always deserve, and the recording he left behind, and the documents he prepared, and the account he quietly filled up, and the lawyer he instructed. All of it was a Sunday morning, extended forward into the future, past the point where he could show up in person. He showed up anyway. That's who Daniel was. That's who he will always be, in that recording and in the things his friends tell me and in the watch that keeps time on my wrist. 34 years old, his mother's eyes. A laugh that filled every room he was ever in. I loved him. I should have told him more. But I think, in the end, he knew. I think he knew. Because love, when it's real, doesn't need to be said as often as it needs to be shown. And he showed it to me in the most complete way he could imagine. I'm trying to do the same thing now. I'm trying to show up for the people still here, the way he showed up for me, without making a production of it, without expecting anything back. Just showing up, bringing groceries, sitting at the table, talking about the small things and the large things until the room fills up and there's no space left for anything dark. If you're watching this and you have someone like that in your life, someone who just keeps showing up, who fixes things before you notice they're broken, who does the quiet work of loving you without asking for credit, please, don't wait for the right words. Don't wait until things feel less raw. The right time is Sunday. The right time is right now. Tell them. I wish I had told Daniel more, but I carry what he gave me, and I carry his name, and every morning when I put on that watch and feel it running against my wrist, I understand something I didn't understand before, that some people love you so well that even after they're gone, the love is still working, still protecting you, still running perfectly. You only have to be willing to open the envelope.